Welcome everyone to this video on understanding additional support for learning planning, including coordinated support plans. This video is based on a popular webinar we did here at Inquire, which we've offered in the past, and we wanted to make sure more families had access to it. So myself, Hannah, I'm one of the Senior Advice and Information Officers at Inquire, and my colleague Beth, who's one of our Advice and Information Officers, are going to talk you through this subject. So Beth will give a brief introduction to Inquire, then I'll explain what we're going to cover in this video, then we will get fully into additional support for learning and planning.
So before we go any further, I'll just explain a little bit about Inquire. So we are the Scottish Advice Service for Additional Support for Learning. We've existed since 1999, so that's more than 22 years. We are funded by the Scottish Government to provide independent advice and information to children and young people, parents, carers and professionals about children's rights and the legislation and guidance related to additional support for learning. And as this slide says, our vision is that all children in Scotland are supported, included and listened to throughout their education. So we do this through a number of things. We have our helpline, it's one-to-one helpline advice, and we can do that via the phone, email, we've got web form and web chat. We also have loads of publications on all of additional support for learning, the key issues surrounding it. One of those is our parents and carers guides, and we also have loads of different fact sheets on particular topics. We have a website, enquire.org.uk, and our website for children and young people, reach.scot. And we also raise awareness through outreach like this and also through social media. So we do all of this with the goal to help you feel more listened to and supported, feel more confident to take action, understand rights and responsibilities, know what steps to take, and know where to find more information and help if you need it.
All right, so thanks, Beth. So obviously there's a lot we could say on additional support for learning in general, but in this video we're going to specifically focus on the planning side of things, which applies in all contexts to different degrees. However, if there are other issues you want advice on, we do have fact sheets and other outreach sessions recorded and on our YouTube channel. On issues like early years, transitions, most of the things you can think of. And you can also get in touch with our helpline team by email, phone and web chat. If there's something that isn't covered, we'll be giving all our details at the end, and there'll also be a link in the video description. You can also tell us in the YouTube comments if there's a specific session you feel we should cover soon, or you can get in touch with us via email. Our plan for this session is to firstly go briefly over the basics, so the key rights and duties around additional support for learning, and then focus specifically on planning your child's learning. We will also cover at the end some of the key questions that we hear from families on these issues, which will include what to do if your child doesn't have a plan, what to do if you're not happy with that plan, and what to do if you feel like your child might be eligible for a coordinated support plan. So we'll cover everything, but do feel free also to skip ahead if there's something specific you want to look at. So to put simply, all children and young people who need help with their learning should receive the support that they need to do the best they can at school, and this support should be kept under review. That part about keeping support under review is the bit from the law that we talk about a lot when we're talking about planning. This law that covers this is called the Additional Support for Learning Act, and it's the main piece of legislation that we're going to talk about today. And although we don't tend to quote law very often in our advice, because we like to focus on what it means for you and your child, it's important to know that when we're talking about additional support for learning, it's not that it's just a nice idea that we're chatting about. This is the law we're talking about. Also, we know that there might be some parents watching with children in nursery or an early learning age. It's important to know that when Beth or I are talking about school or school education and additional support for learning laws, This includes any child who's eligible for funded early years hours. So if your child's in a nursery or other type of early years provisions getting funded hours, we still mean them and their rights when we're talking about planning and additional support for learning rights. And next, it's next really helpful to know what we mean when we say additional support needs. The law says that a child has additional support needs where, for whatever reason, they can't benefit from school education without extra help. The main thing to know with this is what this means is that your child does not need a diagnosis to be entitled to support. As our next slide shows, there are lots of different reasons why a child could be considered to have additional support needs. The key thing is if they need extra or different support compared to their peers to benefit fully from their learning, they are considered to have additional support needs. So what that means is that, these examples on this slide are some of the reasons why a child might need additional support need. But really, it's all about your child's individual needs and their situation and the impact things are having on their learning. So what this means, for example, is a child might be diagnosed with a health condition, but actually not need extra help in school. So they wouldn't be considered to have additional support needs under the law. However, on the other hand, your child might be a young carer, or you might be supporting a child with care experience, or a child that might be being bullied. They may need extras to help at school because something about their lives is impacting their learning, and they would be considered to have an additional support need, even though they don't have a specific diagnosis or possibly entitled to something specific around that. If they have a barrier to their learning, they're entitled to support. It's also important to always remember that multiple issues might be affecting your child. So they might have a learning difficulty, but also being bullied, for example, or they might have dyslexia and then experience bereavement. This should all be considered as part of their additional support needs, and what's the kind of individual things going on with your child that mean that they need additional support. So once we understand a child has additional support need, it helps to know what the law says about how they should be supported. The law says, as it's set out above, that local authorities must make adequate and efficient provision to support children and young people with additional support needs and help them to do the best they can at school. What this means is that your local authority, so that's your council's education department, usually through the schools, through your child's school or nursery, has a duty to provide support that meets your child's individual needs. However, the law doesn't say exactly what support looks like, and that's because, as we already talked about, every child and situation is different, and support should be based on their individual needs. What this does mean as well is that support can take many different forms, and that's part of the reason why planning is so important, because it's about the conversations and seeing how your child's getting on and looking ahead that inform what's the right thing to keep them supported and to keep their learning and development on track. Now, I'm just going to briefly touch on identifying needs, because it's also a key part of planning, because if the school understands your child's needs, it's going to make it a lot easier for them to support them and plan that support. So your local authority, normally through your child's school, has a duty to identify your child's needs so they can provide the right support. This assessment should be an ongoing process and not a one-off activity. So even if your child does get a formal assessment, a few years later, they might need different assessments, but also teachers and support staff should be looking at your child's development and progress in learning throughout the year. It's really an ongoing process, not something that's one-off. They should also take into account any information you provide as parents or carers. So how is your child at home? What's working for them at home can all inform those assessments of what's the right support for them. In some cases, so some might be kind of day-to-day observations of your child or a type of assessment, but there also might be more in-depth assessments done by school staff. So for example, a dyslexia assessment. But then there might also be other assessments where the school need to involve other professionals, such as educational psychologists or child and adult mental health service professionals. Most of the time, families and schools work together to agree the assessment. So if you're concerned, you can go and speak to the school and have a conversation about whether further assessments are needed. But it's important to know that you also do have a right to formally request an assessment of your child. And that's one of your rights as a parent, or your child has that right when they're a bit older. Identifying needs is something we could and may in the future do a whole video on or webinar. But for now, when we're talking about planning, the really key things to know are that your child's needs should be identified. Assessment is not a one-off activity. And just to remember that you have a right to request an assessment. We have a fact sheet and we also did a Q&A on this topic on Facebook, and they are all linked to on our YouTube channel and also on our website if you'd like some more information on that. So as I've already mentioned a few times, in all of this, it's important to know that you and your child have the right to be involved in decisions about your child's education. The key rights I often find come up when speaking to families about planning are that, firstly, you and your child have the right to be involved in decisions about their plans, education and support. You should be updated if things change about your child's support. And also you have a right to bring a supporter or advocate along to meetings, whether that's a friend, family member, or someone more formal. You know, if you're asking for a planning meeting, which we're talking about, you can bring someone along to take notes or just to be another listening ear. We have loads of information on our website and on our fact sheet on working together about tips for getting the most from meetings. But it's an important thing to be aware of. So we finally get officially onto planning after that background. So firstly, it can help to know what the law says about this. So the law says that all children, whether or not they have additional support needs, should have some form of personal learning planning. And then for children with additional support needs, as I said earlier, there is also a duty to make sure that support is kept under review. What planning actually looks like in practice varies across different areas and local authorities, and sometimes even different schools. However, despite this, there are some main principles of how things usually work, which it helps to know to start with. These main principles are quite similar and are often called staged intervention, which I will do a quick run through of now. So although, as I just said, the law doesn't specify exactly what planning should look like for most children with additional support needs, most local authorities have adopted a staged intervention approach. This is the approach for deciding what level of support or intervention a child needs. They might call it something a wee bit different, but the principles are usually the same. What this means is that at stage 1, if your child just needs 1 or 2 minor changes to the support they receive at school or nursery, they might not need a written plan, but you as parents may agree verbally with the school or nursery what those changes and support that they need are, and a date for reviewing them might be a parents' evening or in a meeting. The idea is that support at this stage is usually provided by staff in the classroom. For example, a teacher might adapt how a lesson is taught or provide a visual timetable to help your child cope with changes happening through the school day. This is called stage 1 intervention. Then we have stage 2, which is in some cases if a child has been identified as having additional support needs that need maybe more than just a few minor adaptations or support, that they might benefit from having a formal learning plan or formal learning planning. This might be a CPM or a written plan. Support at this stage might include For example, extra support from a learning support teacher inside or outside of the classroom, taking part in a targeted program, help to cope in the classroom, or strategies like a timeout or quiet space. At this point, that plan might be written, or there might be more formal regular meetings. This plan could set out child's needs and the support that will be put in place to meet their needs. And it could include some kind of short-term goals and who's responsible for providing it. Again, the school should work with you and your child and where necessary other professionals to create that plan and review it regularly. So that's stage 2. Then if more detailed planning is required to meet your child's needs, or they might require input from one or more agencies out with school, a child might be at stage 3 intervention. So this might include outside support like speech and language therapists, occupational health, social work, or outreach workers. And at this stage, they would be expected to have a written learning plan and may also have a coordinated support plan, which Beth's going to explain a bit more about later. And then finally, stage 4 is for children with the most complex needs. In most cases, before a child is placed or moved to stage 4, their case will be referred to a local authority team that oversees support for children with the highest level of needs. They're sometimes called joint planning meetings or staged intervention teams, but your council might have a different authority, might have a different name for the group. Children placed at stage 4 usually need a range of interventions or support and require a high level of planning to meet their needs. At this stage, the local authority may consider opening the coordinated support plan that we'll talk about later. So I've explained all this, but what we focus on the helpline with families is not normally the type of plan or what official stage of intervention your child's at, but the question of, is your child's support being planned? So is there a joint understanding of your child's needs? Are there set goals? Do you have review dates? Do you have time opportunities for you and your child to be involved and have their views heard? So even if perhaps your child does not fit exactly into one of these stages, or you go and speak to the school and they say your child's only at stage 1, it's reasonable that you could ask for some form of note of agreement of your child's needs, how they will be met, and the goals of their support. That could be a really good place to start, even if it kind of doesn't officially fit into these categories. Having that conversation about how are we planning my child's learning and how can I be involved in that and how can we review it can still be a really helpful conversation. Now, you've heard a lot from me, so I'm going to pass on to Beth to talk to you about some of those types of plans.
Thanks, Hannah. So we have just said not to focus too much on the names of plans or the level of stage intervention that you're at, but we do know that it can help to know a bit about what the school means when they start talking about different types of plans. There's always lots of different acronyms for things. So we thought we'd mention some of the most common ones that we hear about. Your local authority might have the same or similar ideas to this. So we thought it might be helpful to hear a little bit about some of the ones that we hear about quite commonly. So most often we hear about IEPs, individualized education plans, or ASPs, additional support plans. These are ones where children have in-school learning needs and there's been some sort of agreement on sort of daily or weekly interventions. These kind of plans usually involve parents and the young people or the children when they put them together. We also sometimes hear about well-being or child's plans. They often look sort of more widely at a child's whole well-being, what is going on for them in all aspects of their lives, rather than just focusing on their education. So these sorts of plans aren't set out in law. That's why I've called them non-statutory on the slide. Basically what they're called and exactly how they're used does vary across local authorities, but you can ask your local authority for information on their policy for additional support for learning, what their plans look like, how it works where you live, if you feel it might help to understand a bit more widely. But as we've said, for you as parents, what's really most important to focus on is whatever plan it is it working for you? Is it working for your child? Are you happy, and is the school happy that they understand what your child's needs are and how they're going to meet those needs? Have you set the goals that are appropriate, and are you reviewing those plans regularly? All of that's really important, probably more so than what necessarily the plan is called. The only statutory plan in Scotland is a coordinated support plan, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about what they are. So coordinated support plans are for pupils with complex or multiple support needs who require significant support from education and at least one other agency. So that could be like social work or healthcare, for example. So CSPs are really designed to help all the professionals working with a young person from different agencies work together to make sure a child or young person has got the support they need with their learning. So the difference with CSPs compared to a child's plan or an IEP is that they are legal documents. So there are certain things that they must contain, and the support in them must be delivered. Local authorities must open a CSP for all pupils who meet the criteria. So just to sum up again, it's an action plan used for some pupils who need significant additional support. It sets broad and long-term goals for a pupil, and really it's designed to support the professionals who are working in different agencies focus together and work together on helping the pupil to achieve those goals. Sometimes children that have got a CSP also have an IEP or an ASP or a child's plan as well, which sets more sort of focus goals to do with their education that maybe they don't need input about from other agencies. But to be eligible for a CSP, your child must meet all of the following criteria. So firstly, a local authority must be responsible for their education. They must need support due to complex or multiple factors that negatively and significantly affect their education. Your child would have to have needs that will or are likely to last for more than a year. And they must need significant additional support from education and from another department of the local authority, like social work, or another agency or agencies to reach their educational goals. So what's important to remember is that most learners who require additional support won't need a CSP. You have to meet those specific criteria that I've just mentioned to be entitled to one. If your child doesn't meet those criteria, that doesn't mean that they're not entitled to support. As we've said already, a child that needs any additional support for whatever reason is entitled to support at school. And like we've said, there's lots of other types of plans that in some cases are more appropriate for your child depending on their needs. Also important to know that a CSP doesn't replace other plans. A CSP quite often only has broader goals, so sometimes it can actually be helpful to have a specific education plan alongside a CSP. Also worth mentioning that all looked after children should be considered for a CSP. If a looked after child doesn't have one, there should have been a discussion and a clear decision made as to why they don't need one. That's just because usually looked after children will have support from different agencies, social work being the most obvious one. We thought it would be worth sort of talking about what that word significant means within the criteria. When the law talks about significant additional support, it means significance from the point of view of the agency providing it, rather than the point of view of the pupil or their parent or carer. So we understand that for you and your child, you might feel that they have significant needs. It's important to remember that it's not about your child's needs being significant so much as it is about the support that the agencies are providing that needs to be significant. So for example, a child might have serious support needs or a disability, but in terms of how they can be supported, that support actually might be quite straightforward or simple. So in this case, the support itself wouldn't be considered significant. So for example, if your child has an occupational therapist to support them at their special school once a week, but the school already has an occupational therapist in the school full time, that support wouldn't be significant because it's quite straightforward to arrange. So when deciding whether a pupil needs significant additional support from education and at least one other agency, the local authority will consider the frequency, the nature, the intensity, and the duration of that support. So it can include support provided on an individual basis. It might include group support in a setting with others. It might be to do with the staff working under the direction and guidance of those from another agency. The local authority will also consider how the agency are involved in supporting your child's educational goals. So, for example, your child might have a hospital appointment every month, but the doctors don't need to work with your child's school to change anything. So although the doctors are involved significantly in your child's life, they probably wouldn't need a CSP to plan their input because they're not supporting an educational goal. Also important to know that you have the right to request that your child is considered for a CSP if you believe that they're eligible. We'll explain later in more detail how you can do this. But before I finish talking about CSPs, it's important to acknowledge we know there's been quite a lot of confusion around CSPs in recent years about who is eligible, when they should be used, and the Scottish Government has acknowledged this as well. We, for example, know some families have been told things like, we don't do CSPs anymore. Might help to know that there's work going on to raise awareness with professionals and with parents as well to tackle this. And hopefully this webinar is a helpful step in that journey. So I know that Hannah and I have covered a lot of information, but we hope that it's really helpful to you. We're just going to go through sort of the most important things to know, really. No matter what the name of the plan or whether your child has one or not, it's important to remember that, first of all, your child's learning should be planned. Your child has the right to support that meets their individual needs, and that support should always be kept under review. Now what we're going to do is run through some commonly asked questions that we hear about from parents and carers. So the one that we hear about most often is that their child doesn't have a plan, or a parent doesn't know if their child has a plan. Few things you can do if that is the case for you and your child. The first thing we would usually recommend is asking for a meeting with your child's school or nursery. It might be that your child does have support in place. There might already be a plan of some kind, and they just haven't informed you properly. So asking for a meeting to discuss your child's support can be a really good way of just finding out what's going on. Also gives you the chance then, if you're in a meeting and there isn't a plan, to talk about how you could get one in place, what might work for your child, all the stuff we've talked about before. We would recommend talking about planning in general rather than focusing on a specific type of plan. As we've said, different local authorities do them in different ways. There might be different reasons for needing one type of plan over another. Ultimately, as a parent, it shouldn't really be your responsibility to understand what type of plan is needed. What you should be needing to know is your child getting the support that they need? How the school does that, the school need to worry about. So just talking about planning in general, what are the school planning for your child? How are they doing the planning? That's the most important thing. Different types of plan, as I've said, work better in different situations. Your school should know about that, and your local authority should know about that too. So sometimes it can be helpful to ask about what your local authority's planning procedure is, because, as I said, you don't want to be asking for the wrong type of plan. So focus on, are you planning my child's support, and what does that look like? Another issue that we hear about is parents or children not being happy with the plan that is in place. First thing that we would recommend, if that is the case for you, is asking to review the plan. As we've said already, ask for a meeting about that, ask for a meeting to review your child's support, to review the plan that is in place. And as we've said, you can bring along an advocate or a friend or family member with you to that kind of meeting. We would also recommend, quite often it's helpful to write to the school ahead of the meeting to let them know what you want to talk about. So are there specific things in the plan that you're concerned about? Are there things missing? Are there things that could be done differently? And what is it that you'd like to talk about if you have ideas? Definitely letting them know ahead of time gives them a bit of a chance at the school or nursery to think about how they can better meet those needs, or what ideas they can share with you. Quite often what's helpful is to make a plan more specific. So particularly if you've got issues or concerns around how that support is being delivered, having more specific goals in the plan can help to make that better. So you might want to be asking, why is this the right support? What's the goal for this support? If that goal is not being met, is something not working, or is the support the right kind of support? Should something different or extra be done as well, or instead? There's also ways to escalate your concerns if you need to. So we would first of all ask or recommend that you speak to the head of additional support for learning at your school, but following that you can escalate it up to the head teacher. Beyond that, you can go directly to your local authority. Then there's more formal procedures like mediation, formal complaints, all sorts of stuff. There's a lot of information there if you did need to escalate your concerns, which hopefully you wouldn't need to, but we actually have a fact sheet all about that called Avoiding and Solving Problems. So if you do feel like you've had a meeting, it's still not quite what you want it to be, or you've still got concerns, that fact sheet goes through step by step the ways that you can escalate that concern and hopefully come to some sort of arrangement that you're all happier with. The last one we hear about is more specifically about CSPs. Parents sometimes say, I think that my child should have one, or they think their child should have one and the school have said no. First thing to do, as we mentioned already, is consider the criteria for a CSP. CSPs have really specific criteria, and it might not actually be everything that you're looking for. They are about coordinating support across different agencies. So sometimes that's not what's needed if your child isn't receiving support from more than one place. Sometimes an IEP or one of those other types of plans is better because it's more focused on education specifically. Really, you want to think about what is it that you're looking for. So is the concern that you have about the level of support or the way that the support is delivered? That's a different conversation. It's less to do with CSPs and more to do with planning support. And as we've said, going in a more general sense of I'm concerned about the way that my child is being supported, or I want to talk about how my child's support is being planned, leads to a more open conversation and can be quite productive, I think. You can request a CSP if you want to. The first thing that you can do is speak to your child's school. If you think that they're eligible, your child's school, if they agree, can help you with that process. But you can also make your own request in writing or some other form that can be recorded. We've got a fact sheet all about CSPs that explains what you need to include if you are making that request. And you would make that request with the school support, or you can make it directly to the local authority. Beyond that, there are things that you can do if you apply for a CSP and it's refused, or if you've got concerns about the delivery of that support or the contents of a CSP, you would then, basically your concern would go to the Additional Support Needs Tribunal, and there's a support group called Let's Talk ASN that would be able to support you with that process. Again, we've got fact sheets that explain all about that, if that's the direction that you need to go in. That's me. So I hope the webinar was helpful. Hopefully we've answered a lot of your questions. If you've got any feedback about whether you found the session helpful, what we could improve, any other topics that you'd like covered, as Hannah said, you can comment on this video, you can email us at info@enquire.org.uk. We've also got social media and all that sort of stuff. In the video description, you'll find a link to all the resources that we've mentioned. And if you do have any further questions, remember you can contact us on our helpline, by phone, by email, by web form, or by web chat.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to us. Goodbye.